Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, object-oriented ontology. So this is the last video, settle in. This is the last video of this series. We've looked at kind of the main points of object-oriented ontology as Harman points out in that short introductory book of his. And in this video, I'm just going to go through and kind of analyze each one of those points, give kind of my opinion about them, what I like about it, what I don't like. So the structure of this video, each section is going to be a topic, one of the topics that we've talked about in the prior 3 videos. And then generally the next thing I'll do is, generally the first thing I'll do in each topic is try and give what I like about it, try and identify something positive. And often there is, the way I like to describe this, there's like a kernel of truth in everything that Harman comes up with. All of the points that Harman makes, there's like a kernel of truth behind them, underneath all of them. However, it's usually covered over, or that kernel is kind of taken in a different direction. Harman picks it up and takes it in a different direction. And that'll be the next part. That'll be the second thing I address, will be what I see as the negative, or what I don't like about the topic that we're looking at. And usually that's going to be the way that Harman sees that topic. So usually the positive is kind of the way I see it, which is more often than not different from the way Harman sees it. So the end result is basically what I like in object-oriented ontology is not what Harman likes about it, or the value I see in it is different from the value that Harman has, or the value that Harman would put on it, I think. But that's okay. It's interesting. It's interesting to think about. And yeah, it's a nice little book to have read and to have kind of digested. And yeah, it never hurts to know a little bit more. One note before we start is concerning just one term, actually, kind of a key term, I guess, ontology. So the way Harman uses the word ontology in the book, it's kind of like a synonym for reality, or fundamental reality as it really is. And that's totally not how I would use the word. So what, for me, the word that captures that tries to understand reality is metaphysics. So I might switch between those two, and because metaphysics is what I would call it, Harman calls it ontology, but we're talking about the same thing. If I do, or when I introduce the word metaphysics, I'm talking about the same thing that Harman talks about when he uses the word ontology. All right, so let's hit the first topic, which is objects. Okay, so the definition of objects, kind of that middle point between undermining and overmining, right? Reducing a thing to its basic constituents and reducing a thing to its effects on other objects, its effects in the world. So what's positive about this? When I realized that I liked this idea, or this definition, was when I decided that it's neither right nor wrong. This definition is not something you can say is correct. It's what metaphysical reality or ontology really is. He's uncovered the truth here, capital T truth. Or the other way, you can't say this is just totally wrong. He's flat out wrong. He's got the whole picture around backwards. Neither of those are the right way to approach this. What it is, it's just a way of looking at the world. It's a tool for understanding things and events, and that's it. If you try and make it into something more grand than that, more kind of absolute, something that's absolutely right or wrong, then I think you've missed the utility of it, and that isn't the way we should be thinking about this. And a good example, I think, of this as being useful, a useful way of approaching reality, is Tim Morton's hyperobjects. So those are basically objects that are either too big or endure for too long a time for us, with our finite lifetimes and our finite perspectives, to properly grasp, to properly apprehend. And this definition of objects, whatever can't be undermined, whatever isn't undermined or overmined, lets us kind of step outside that a natural way of relating to things, which is to me personally, right? And that's kind of the phenomenological drive, motivation, is how do I experience things? And that's the value of phenomenology. But it means that there are some things that just don't appear for me. And one good example is global warming, which is an event that just takes place on a scale which has no relevance, no significance to me as an individual human being. So it's easy to miss it, to not fully grasp it, and not see how relevant it is in my life, because it's something I can't grasp as an individual person. But this way of breaking things up, this way of approaching reality, gets us out of that perspective. It lets us see the world in a different way, see events and objects that we might not otherwise have seen. So I like that. That's positive. The negative, however, is that I don't think Harman means it to be a way of looking at the world. He doesn't see object-oriented ontology as just another approach which we can use alongside other tools. He sees it as ontology, as absolute truth, fundamental reality. He sees it as right, in that way that I was talking about earlier. And I think that kind of misses something of value there when you get caught up in trying to make this to give this kind of absolute give this an absolute scope, make it something that applies to reality itself, then I think you miss something that is positive in this. And the other negative point is that this definition of an object is totally human-centered, right? I mean, undermining and overmining, there is no absolute place from which you could determine an object as something which is in the middle, that midpoint between undermining and overmining. There is no absolute resting place, if you like, which guarantees a fixed object like that. Undermining and overmining necessarily seems to me to refer to a perspective, and that perspective is going to be some kind of conscious being or some kind of agent or subject, and that's us, right? Which is a problem for Harman, because he claims this is a flat ontology. This is getting at the zero-person aspect of things. Remember that definition, or that description, the zero person aspect. But I can't see that at all. This is totally dependent on a perspective, which will be then a finite perspective, a limited perspective. It's going to be one perspective of many, and for me that's fine. That feeds into the value, the benefit of this definition. But I think for Harman, it winds up being a bit of a contradiction, right? It's not a zero person aspect of things. It's totally inclusive of and dependent on people. So anyway, that's objects. The second topic, real objects. Okay, so this notion of real objects, the kind of Kantian dimension to Harman's philosophy, the Kantian thing in itself. Unfortunately, I don't like this at all. I just couldn't get on board with this way of thinking. And the problem for me is not so much the unknowability, the fact that there is at kind of the level of metaphysical reality, the idea that we can't know it, we can't pass it, if you like. The problem for me is that reality for Harman is broken into objects in any meaningful sense of the word object. So the idea that fundamental reality is somehow independent of humans, or independent of a conscious perspective, already broken up into these discrete objects. But then, and again, like, what does an object mean then? Undermined and overmined, right? That the balance between the two. But then if there's no perspective, how can there be any kind of undermining or overmining balance? How can there be any reference to that? So so that's kind of the problem for me with this notion of real objects and real qualities. Not so much the fact that there's an unknowability. I think that's inevitable when you're talking about metaphysics or ontology, as Harman would put it. But the idea that this fundamental reality is somehow broken up into objects, and the problem is that word just doesn't seem to mean anything at that level of description. Objects don't seem to exist meaningfully at all at that level. So anyway, that's kind of just a general thought. However, there is a positive that I took from this, and again, it's like this is like a kernel of truth behind the idea of the thing in itself, the notion that there is that fundamental reality is unknowable, and that's what it is. That metaphysical reality is ungraspable, unknowable in the normal sense of knowing. That is to say, kind of the subject object. That's how we know. That's how we understand things. We break things up. We approach things by parts. You know, we analyze, we dissect, and that's how we've evolved to understand things. That's how our minds work. And that this was the genius behind Kant's idea, I think, that he fully understood, perhaps for the first time, that we bring something to our understandings of reality. We carve it up according to the way we've evolved, the way our minds have evolved to interpret reality, and it is a knowledge. It's a knowledge of parts. It's a knowledge of the parts that make up the whole, and that knowledge will not be transferable to the whole itself. That's kind of the key idea here for me. And this is straight out of Bergson. I really think Bergson nailed it with this understanding of metaphysics, of the whole. And so metaphysical reality, ontology, is unknowable in a genuine, true sense of the word. But it's not that we can never then say anything about it, or we have no inkling of it. Wouldn't go so far as to say anything like that, the way that Kant did. But we can't know it the way we understand the word know. The way we approach the parts that we see in the whole. We can't take that same. We can't use the same methodology to understand the whole, which means our understanding of the whole is going to be of a completely different nature. Not necessarily mystical, not supernatural or anything like that, but just it's going to be more ambiguous. It's going to be unclear. It is going to leave us kind of feeling a little bit dissatisfied, because the way we know things, the way we know parts, is through the categories of our minds. There's no better way to put it than the way Kant did. The way that we dissect the whole into parts. That is how we understand reality, and that gives us a kind of clear, solid understanding of things. And so we can apply rigorous tools like mathematics to reality. These things, they fit together so smoothly. However, when it comes to dealing with the whole, this is a fundamentally different thing from the parts. So those tools, those analytical tools, that way of thinking, the mathematical models that work so well in describing the parts, are not going to work at the level of the whole itself. And so that's what I like about this. That's the kernel of truth, I think, that's behind this idea that the real is unknowable. However, the negatives. So what I don't like about this, the real objects, Harman's real objects, is, as I mentioned already, I'm not sure the word object can be meaningfully applied to metaphysical reality itself. I think an object always requires a perspective. If there is no perspective, then there's just no meaningful sense, and there is no sense in which we can say that there is an object. And even, like I mentioned before, even Harman seems to agree, because an object for him is a compromise between undermining and overmining, and all of that requires a perspective. Another problem is how Harman can even talk about real objects and real qualities, how he can even know they exist if the real is unknowable, if we don't have any kind of direct access to it. And I think Harman doesn't fully respect the unknowability of the real that he proclaims in the book. I mean, he's quite clear that we can't know anything about real objects or real qualities. Every time they pop up, they're cancelled. We cancel the real object in metaphor. We cancel the real qualities in knowledge. And what has to step in for those things is myself, that the beholder or the knower has to step in with their own as the object or the qualities. So, I mean, he's quite clear that this is a realm about which we have no direct access, and yet somehow he's claiming that reality, fundamental reality, is broken up into these real objects with real qualities. And that seems a bit of a contradiction. And of course, contrast this with the way that Kant approached this. He said, his thing in itself was fundamentally mysterious. He never said anything about it. He didn't make any claims about the noumenal. I mean, he didn't say that it's broken up into different parts and they have different qualities. It's just that we don't know what they are. I feel like he respected this divide that he set up. So in a way that I think Harman probably hasn't in the book. And the other thing is the idea of this discontinuous metaphysics in which objects exist but are unknowable seems a little bit like kind of maybe a simplistic overlaying of our contingent perceptual experience onto reality itself. Kind of taking, the way that we see the world, which is broken up into objects and parts, and just kind of overlaying that onto metaphysical reality. Oh, well, that must be the way metaphysical reality is as well, broken up into objects with qualities. It's just that we don't know what they are. And that seems like, that's not the right way to approach metaphysics or ontology. For no other reason, then it's a misapplication of the parts and the whole again. Coming back to that distinction, it's treating the parts as kind of indicative of the whole, as if the whole is either a big part, just a part kind of raised to the level of the whole, or that the whole is a big collection of parts. And neither of those, I think, really capture metaphysical reality. Harman's view is the latter, I think, that reality or ontology is kind of a collection of parts, just parts that we don't know anything about. So those are the negatives concerning real objects. But I also did want to take this idea of Harman's that we only have indirect access to reality, including ourselves. So this is something he says very early in the book. We only have indirect access to reality, and that includes ourselves. This was the reason I wanted to focus on this, is because there is some value in this. There are a couple of kernels of truth, I think, that are worth pointing out. And this is where I agree with the statement that we do only have indirect access, but indirect in the sense that we can't know an object wholly and completely. We can't know an object, not in the the real realm or the noumenal realm or whatever, but we can't know a real just said real, we can't know an object that we perceive wholly and completely. And regarding objects that we perceive, these are always going to be relative to our undermining and overmining perspectives, right? So there's always going to be more to know about an object depending on where we place that cutoff line, between undermining and overmining. And I do cover that later, so that's cool. Another way is that we don't have complete knowledge of objects is just due to our perspectives, just good old-fashioned Husserlian phenomenology. We see appearances, we see those Abschattung. We never see every single possible appearance at the same time, or even ever. We never get a chance to experience every single perspective. There are an infinite number of different perspectives we can take on any object, so there's always going to be some aspect of the object that escapes us. But this doesn't mean that there's a hidden metaphysical realm which we have no access to. And Merleau-Ponty is also good on this when he talks about the inexhaustible nature of the thing. The thing is always more than we can pin it down as. So that's the kernel of truth there regarding objects, and the same with selves, regarding ourselves. We only have indirect access to ourselves in the sense that we can't know ourselves wholly and completely. Look no further than Sartre for this. I am what I am not, and I'm not what I am. That's what the for itself is. It's this. He talks about that game of the game of mirrors in being in nothingness. We're not something solid that we can encapsulate in a definition that we can perfectly and adequately describe. We always escape our own definitions of ourselves. Merleau-Ponty, again, the self is never a completed synthesis. It's a relation with the world. It's always engaged. It's not something we can pin down and fix. And I've written my own modest contribution to this topic. I wrote an article recently about the way that we are our actions and behaviors, and these are things that are externally directed, things that we can't know from the inside, from the one doing the acting, from the one doing the behaving the way that we are. These are things that are only knowable from the outside, from an external perspective, and we never get that perspective on ourselves. So again, the self is unknowable. That's the kernel of truth, I think, in this statement. We only have indirect access to reality. However, as always, this is not, I think, Harman's point in making this claim. For Harman, we only have indirect access because the real has an ungraspable essence. There's some kind of core to the thing, to the object, which always eludes us. It's in a different, realm, or it somehow escapes our feeble attempts to understand it. And so I think the way that he's kind of describing this, it sounds like every sensible object covers over a real object. Every sensual object hides a real object deep down. And so all we're getting is the kind of superficial aspect, when there is this core, this real object underneath that we never have access to. However, I think this quickly deteriorates into, I call it a metaphysical maya. It deteriorates into kind of more problems than postulating it solves. So, for example, if every sensual object is correlated to a real object in some way that we have no inkling of, then there must be an infinite number of real objects, because the balance between undermining and overmining, as tied to a perspective, is infinite. There are an infinite number of objects we can create out of the world, right? I mean, and Harman talks about this with the Beatles. It was my example as well. The Beatles, the band, that's an object. But also the four people who make it up, they're also objects. If we change the level at which that cutoff point between undermining and overmining, if we change that, we can go from the Beatles as an object to the individual members of the Beatles as objects, to their body parts as objects, to their atoms as objects. All of these things are objects, and it just depends on where we place that balance between undermining and overmining. So is there a real object corresponding to every single sensual object? Then there must be an infinite number of real objects. And we start descending into, kind of metaphysics that really doesn't go anywhere, because all you can say at that point is Well, we just don't know. It's a mystery, right? That's the metaphysical realm. That's the realm of real objects and real qualities. We can't say anything about it. But then, why say anything about it at all? So yeah, infinite real objects. How do these real objects come about? If we know that there are real objects, we must. It's fair to ask, I think, how they correlate to the sensual objects. Is there a one-to-one correlation? If there is a one-to-one correlation, is it just a mere doubling of the sensual object? Are we just positing a real object for every sensual object, which does nothing? The real objects have no role to play. They're just there in the theory. In which case, again, why have them? So I think that just opens kind of a Pandora's box for me. Which I think we just don't need it. We just don't need it to have a good metaphysics. So that's kind of my take on the real objects, the Kantian thing in itself aspect of Harman's philosophy. The next topic, aesthetics. All right, so aesthetics. So the main thing that Harman talked about in this topic, in the section, was metaphor, and the thing I really liked about this, and I don't want to underplay this. Even it's like in my notes here, it's just like three words, and then there's a whole bunch of negatives. But this positive, I think, is really Harman deserves credit for this. More than appears in kind of the notes and in this video in terms of time that I'm going to spend on the positive versus the negative. It's the fact that it requires human participation. It requires our active engagement with the work of art or the metaphor, or whatever it is we're talking about, whatever the aesthetic object is. I think that's a really, really good point that has been underplayed, as far as I'm aware. I mean, I haven't studied philosophy of art or aesthetics in much detail, but this seems like a really crucial piece of the puzzle here, and Harman, I think, is absolutely right to put that front and center. So that's the positive. The negative, however, I feel like there's just too much going on with this. He's so obviously it involves real objects and it involves that whole picture of Harman's, real objects, real qualities, all of that, sensual objects, sensual qualities, and I've already kind of pointed out that I'm not a big fan of that. So that obviously plays into my dislike of where he goes with metaphor, but there does seem to be too much happening here. The first thing is that, and this is perhaps just a small thing, but he claims that metaphor can't work by similarity. A metaphor can't get its effectiveness from being similar to the thing that it's being compared with. Or, he says, it would be literal. But that seems it just can't be true. Surely a metaphor must be similar in some way. It's not going to be literally similar, but it must have some connection to the thing that you're describing, that you're using to describe it with, or else anything could be a metaphor, which is clearly false. So I think metaphor does absolutely work through similarities, and that doesn't make it literal. So that's just kind of the first point, which is not so serious, but something that I thought of. The second thing, and this is a little bit more serious, is that I think there's a contradiction here. So remember the whole process of metaphor. We've got the real object, originally the real object, and the sensual qualities of the metaphor. the thing that we're using, the thing that we're comparing the original object to, but the real object's inaccessible, so I step in for the real object. So it's me as real object plus the sensual qualities of the metaphor. That's what makes up the metaphor, right? So that's fine. But if the real object becomes me, or if I become the real object here, then we have, and Harman agrees, we have the creation of a totally new object, right? Different from the original real object we were curious about, that we made the metaphor to support. And so then the metaphor, and aesthetics more generally, tells us nothing about any real object. It tells us nothing about the thing itself, not even indirect access, because the thing itself is gone. I've stepped in for the thing itself, and I don't know what the thing itself is. I don't know what the real object is any more than anyone else, and because the real object is inaccessible, right? So if that's gone and I've stepped in, then the metaphor is no longer about the thing that it was supposed to originally be about. And I think I mentioned this in the earlier video too. Harman seems a little bit cagey about this. He says, I think I quoted this in the second video. He says that metaphor gives us something like the infamous thing in itself, but something like is kind of ambiguous, and it seems that there is a definite tension here, because I can't see exactly how this plays out. It's a nice picture, and it kind of passes muster at first glance if you don't look too deeply, but I think when you really think about it, things start to look a little shaky. And further, the real object, let's just take that real object again. If I step in, it's me as the real object that's stepping in, Harman says, into this picture. So there's still a real object and sensual qualities. It's just that instead of the real object being the original thing we were talking about, I've become that real object now. But I can't know myself as a real object either. So that must be cancelled as well, surely, which means that there's a sensual object instead. So now the metaphor becomes sensual object, sensual qualities, in which case the real object is redundant. As soon as we introduce it, we have to cancel it. And that follows from the position that the real object is inaccessible. We have no direct access to it. So again, just what is this real realm doing in Harman's philosophy? And the last thing I want to say about this is just have a look at the definition he gives for metaphor or art as unjustified true belief. This is not a huge part of his philosophy. It's kind of an add-on. I understand that, but I really didn't like this actually. And I'll tell you why. I'll take each one of those words one by one. So first, unjustified. Okay, so it's unjustified. Metaphor is unjustified, he says, because it's not literal. Okay, that's true. And okay, you could say that, it's unjustified because it's not literal. However, I think, according to what I just said about the real object, I think it's actually unjustified because it isn't about the real object. It's about me. And it's not even about me as a real object. It's about me as a sensual object. In which case, that makes the whole thing rightly unjustified, correctly unjustified. Not just because it's not literal, but because I don't even know what we're talking about anymore. We've burned through all of our real objects, and we're left with the sensual object, which is me. So I think that's a better account of why metaphor is unjustified in this picture. The word true, something is definitely not right with this. So the way that Harman gets to true is by saying metaphor is not untrue. Okay, so he doesn't come out and say it's true because blah, blah, blah. He says it's not untrue. Notice the double negative. Anytime you get that, there's something going on behind the scenes that you should be aware of. And what that something is that metaphor is also not true. It's not untrue, but it's also not true. That's why Harman doesn't say it. He doesn't say it is true because he knows it's not. But it's also not untrue. The reason is because it's a completely new object, right? The picture, the metaphor, real object plus sensual qualities, is a completely new object created by us in the aesthetic experience. So we can say it's real. I remember those 4, was it? 4 or 5, I better check that. The 4 false assumptions of science at the very beginning. One of those was anti-literalism, fictionalism. I think that might have been what it was. But the idea that just because it's not real, it's because it's not physical, doesn't mean not real. Just because it's not physical, it doesn't mean that it's not real. So this object that we've created, this new real object, sensual quality object that we have, is fictional. It has no physical existence anywhere, but it's still real. It's still real, no problem there. It exists. But that's different from saying it's true or untrue. I think there's no real sense in which you can apply the words true or untrue, true or false, to this thing. It just is. It exists. It's not true. It's not untrue. It's just real. And so, true is not the right word to use here. And that's why Harman can get away with saying it's not untrue, because he's not committing himself to the opposite, which would sound a little bit strange. And it does sound strange to say there's this new object, this metaphor that you've created, and it's true because you created it, or because it's in your imagination. That's not the right word. It's real. It exists. But I think truth and falsehood just don't apply here. So I have a problem with the way that Harman gets to the word true. I think there is a bit of semantic play going on to get this conclusion. And then finally, belief. Well, what is metaphor belief about? We've just said it. There's no real object anymore. We've cancelled our real objects. What are we talking about? What do we believe in? The created object, the object in my imagination. But then why do I need to believe in that? It's already. I mean, I don't need to believe in it. I've imagined it. There's nothing to believe in. So I don't think it's a belief either. So I have kind of a problem with all 3 of those terms: unjustified, true, and belief. And I think, in general, this little section defining aesthetics or metaphor as unjustified true belief is really, I don't think there's anything substantial here. It strikes me as a little bit of semantics. Kind of, he's choosing definitions to get the outcome he wants. He's defining true in such a way that he can kind of get by saying it's not untrue, therefore let's say it's true. Unjustified as well kind of gets through by saying it's not literal, which is correct, but there's a bigger reason why it's unjustified, and a more serious problem, I think, if we look at it critically. So anyway, not so fussed on the unjustified true belief. It's not a core part of Harman's philosophy. It's just something he threw in. I think he's connecting it back to Plato. Plato said something similar. So fine, but that didn't do anything special for me anyway. All right, the next section, ontography. Okay, so unfortunately, I really don't have much to say about this. I don't have much positive to say about Harman's ontography. As I've already said, I don't like the notion of the real object, real qualities element to object-oriented ontology. So this is going to kind of fail right from the start for me, because real object, real qualities, that's half of ontography. And the whole purpose of it is to kind of make these connections, to connect real objects, real qualities with central objects and central qualities in all these different ways, and get something useful from it. But yeah, half of the picture, I think, has missed the mark. So ontography also as a whole misses the mark for me. Specifically, the things I didn't like, first of all, as soon as I read this in the book, and it became clear that this was going to be like a model, 4 points that we can kind of connect up in different ways. I kind of didn't like that. It strikes me that these kinds of models of reality tend to be kind of simplistic and a little bit artificial, I think. A little bit contrived even. And whatever value you get, I think, from a model like this, you've kind of paid a steeper price in sacrificing clarity or depth of understanding, I think. Or you've gained clarity, but you've sacrificed depth of understanding, I think, is probably the better way to say it. So models then, these kinds of simplified representations of reality, are good for science, right? And that's not a criticism of science, but that's because science is just not about describing reality. It's not about explaining reality. It's about modeling reality. It's about picturing it, understanding it in such a way that we can use it to do certain things, that we can manipulate reality. And again, not in a negative sense of that word, but so that we can intervene in ways that help us live more comfortable lives, that help us have more conveniences, which, our whole society is built on science for sure. Not just technology, but health and medicine. This is all science, and this is all on the back of models, representations of reality. But these don't describe reality. They don't explain reality. And so I don't know if that might come as a shock to you to hear me say that. I don't know if I'd said it before. I've certainly written a couple of articles about it, but I don't think science explains reality. It substitutes a model of reality for reality. And that's why I like philosophy so much, because philosophy actually is about reality, particularly phenomenology, existentialism. These fields dive down into the muck. They get into the right into the dirt, of what reality really is. We get stuck in and describe things that get left behind in a more simplified and useful, for sure, but more simplified model. So anyway, that was kind of my first critique. And interestingly, I remember in The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer, was it that? something Schopenhauer wrote, and he criticized Kant's 12 categories, the way that Kant divided them up into these 4 groups of three categories each. And I remember thinking that that's a fair criticism, actually, because although it's useful, although it's a nice way of describing the picture, it is a little bit artificial. You could break it up in different ways depending on the criterion you use and the way you're approaching the mind or the categories in this case. But yeah, I remember Schopenhauer's kind of not being so receptive to this neat division of the mind into these four groups of 3, 4 categories with each with 3. What am I saying? Four groups, each with 3 categories in them. And I think it's the same kind of thing here. Just a model that's a bit too simple to adequately describe reality. Okay, the second thing was space and time. So Harman says that space and time both result from these tensions that he identifies in his model. Space comes from the tension between real object and sensual qualities, and time from sensual object and sensual qualities. Okay, so the kernel of truth here, the positive in this, is that basically it means that space and time are connected to an experiencing subject, right? There's with space there are sensual qualities, so it's got to be tied into a perspective that perceives sensual qualities. Time is all sensual object and sensual qualities, so connected to an experiencing subject. That's exactly what phenomenology tells us. So the kernel is good. There is a kernel of truth here, I think. The negative, however, well, the first thing with space, I just don't see how, if the real object is ungraspable, if it's beyond our ability to access, how can space arise from a real object sensual quality combination? As we saw with metaphor, the real object has to be cancelled. I have to step in for it. There's no other way around that. But then it becomes sensual object, sensual qualities, or a real object, which is me, and then sensual qualities. But then again, I don't know myself as a real object, so cancel that. Yeah, I can't see how you can get space from a real object sensual quality tension if the real object is ungraspable. And concerning both of them, space and time, even putting that aside, I just found the whole picture here a little bit simplistic, which I think is it's inherent in the whole structure, the whole idea of this rubric. Space, as if somehow noticing the real object and the sensual qualities, the tension between the two, the way that the sensual qualities are loosely bound to the real object, as if that would somehow make me suddenly think in terms of space, would somehow induce me to see the world in spatial terms. I'm not sure, just not sure of the mechanics here. And the same thing with time. Sensual objects, sensual qualities. Okay, qualities change. We notice that the sensual qualities change while the sensual object underneath endures. But isn't that just time? Isn't that what we're supposed to be explaining? If we're going to explain time, don't we have to explain that very thing? How it is that sensual qualities seem to change while the sensual object underneath remains fixed, endures. So I found the whole picture here, something missing from this. It just didn't seem to hit the target for me at all. I don't know if I'm missing something. I don't know if he explains this in more detail somewhere else, but yeah, for me, I didn't get it. Did not get it. Same thing with causation. Kind of, again, just superficial. I didn't see that there was a real explanation of anything here. I mean, all he said is one sensual object impacting another sensual object. That's kind of how we perceive causation. But again, isn't that the thing we're supposed to be explaining? How it is that two objects appear to be connected in this causal relation. I'm the site of it, sure, because it's all sensual objects, but I didn't see any explanation here for causation. And vicarious causation, obviously this just, I couldn't make heads or tails of this. Real objects affect each other through the sensual objects they present to each other. But, I mean, again, how can we talk about the real objects at all? How is Harman deciphering any of this? If the real object is unknowable, I mean, how is it possible that he can tell us what real objects are doing, and that not only what they're doing, but they're presenting sensual objects to each other, which they somehow manage to perceive, as if the real objects are perceiving, and they become kind of agents, subjects. So I couldn't see where the sensual object comes from here, right? The sensual object is the difference between undermining and overmining. Do the real objects perform this? Do they undermine? Do they spot? You know, do they find that sweet spot between undermining and overmining in some way? I couldn't get my head around any of this. So yeah, the ontography thing kind of missed the mark for me. But yeah, that's what I have to say about that. All right, society and politics. Right, so society and politics, much more favourable reception of this, I'm glad to say. Society, the way that we can analyse a situation by looking at all of the objects, this definition of an object lets us, I already mentioned the way it lets us get at, kind of outside of everything referring to me, and kind of thinking only about other people's actions and my actions, and thinking about these other objects and the roles that they might have. I think that's definitely useful. Breaking up the world like that, breaking up a situation, seeing what other objects we can pick out, and where this might lead to things that we can do that can affect more change, or affect more positive change, the change that we're looking for. That's definitely good. And I like that aspect of object-oriented ontology. I also like the 4 stages that Harman points out in object development. That's another useful tool, another nice way of looking at the world and thinking about the world. Yeah, nothing negative to say about that. Politics also, I liked the idea of political knowledge being impossible. That definition was quite nice, actually. Various stakeholders engaging in a dispute that ends in a resolution. There's no sense in which there's any certainty, that there is no sense in which there's anything to be known, to be, it's all fluid, and it's a grasp of different people's perspectives, with different interests. Different stakeholders have different interests, and it's accommodating all of those. That seems like a really nice definition of politics, and in that case there is no political knowledge, there is no certainty, there's no explicit object to be found here. It's all kind of contingent, it's all dependent on the perspectives of the people involved. So I like that. It's nice. The only problem I had with this section, with both, that applies to both society and politics, is Harman's claim that humans aren't the most important subjects. Aren't the most important objects. So we're just objects like any other object, and some objects are more important than we are. And some of the things he talked about, the atomic bomb, the printing press. Yeah, okay. So if we think about society, sure, other objects can have a greater impact than a single person. But ultimately, these objects are determined by us. We decide what the objects are. We use them. We put them to use. I think there's no value in pretending that we're just another object like all other objects in the circumstance or the situation. So I really didn't like that aspect. He doesn't focus on it a huge amount. Certainly not the extent to which Jane Bennett does in Vibrant Matter, and I want to look at that in the next video. But it's kind of there, underlying object-oriented ontology, and I'm not overly fussed about that. The same with the political, right? If humans aren't the most important objects, well, various stakeholders engage in a dispute. Who are the stakeholders engaging in the dispute? It's not the printing press or the atomic bomb. It's us, right? So yeah, I don't see any value in diminishing the human object. Okay, I can see my way through to calling us an object, but I just don't see any value in diminishing us or trying to put us down, put us on a par with all of the other inanimate objects that are involved. And that brings me to the next section, flat ontology. This is going to be a very short section because I just don't like it. I just don't like this notion of a flat ontology. As I said before, I don't see any value in pretending that we are the same as every other object. We're clearly different. We're clearly the only subjects in the room. But yeah, so I don't see any point at all in trying to pretend that we aren't more important. And there seems to be this kind of drive at the moment to diminish the human being, diminish us to, well, we thought we were the center of God's creation, and now we're not. We thought we were the center of the universe, and now we discover we're not. We thought we were greater than or better than all of the other members of the animal kingdom, and now we find we're not. Let's just keep pushing us down until we're on a par with inanimate objects. This is just going too far for me. I totally can't get behind that. I don't think we're equal with other animals either. I mean, I think there's a clear difference. And I don't see it as being discriminatory to say that. It's just a fact. So yeah, I'm not into this flat ontology. And the other thing is that humans appear in just about everything Harman has to say. I mean, we're a central component in virtually everything here, from aesthetics to knowledge to ontology, to his ontography, right? We're 50% of that. I mean, we feature in everything. We feature in the book in so many places that it seems kind of strange to then turn around and say, but we're just on a par with every other inanimate inanimate object. So yeah, not into this flat ontology push at all. And that's it for that. The final section is going to be knowledge. All right, knowledge. So starting with the positives for this. What I liked about this was the notion of paradigm. And that's that idea that there are background assumptions which come into play in order to obtain knowledge. There's always, the object always appears on a background of often unstated assumptions. And I like that. And I think that that's true. But that's just phenomenology, right? That's exactly what phenomenology says. But it dives into it in much more detail. And another reason I like this is it ties knowledge to human beings. It makes knowledge of objects dependent on us, relational. And again, that strikes me as something that is true if the word object is to be used in any meaningful sense of the word, and that I think pervades all of Harman's object-oriented ontology. So that's positive. The negative then, paradigm. For Harman, this I think is kind of a contradiction again. It contradicts the flat ontology that we are no different from every other inanimate object out there. Rather, knowledge is explicitly dependent on us. Great for me. That's exactly what I think. But I think it pushes against one of Harman's central claims, which is that we're just like any other inanimate object. Not even animals, but we're like every other inanimate object. We have the same impact. And the other negative here was really the exact same problems that we saw with metaphor. The real qualities, this time instead of the real object, it's real qualities. Real qualities are unknowable here in knowledge. So I step in, I contribute my real qualities to this, but I can't know my own real qualities, so we've got to cancel. We should have to cancel those as well, and we're down to sensual qualities again, meaning that the real qualities are again redundant, the same way that the real object was with metaphor. And the whole thing just, again, it's just kind of, it seems too complicated and unnecessarily so. There's just too much happening for me here. And we come to the other parallel with metaphor. Metaphor, remember, aesthetics was unjustified true belief. Knowledge is justified untrue belief. And I have the same problem that I had back in metaphor here. I don't think this actually means anything when you finally dig down into it. So justified, let's take each one separately quickly. Justified, he says it's justified because it lets us accomplish a lot. Our knowledge is justified. Belief in knowledge is justified because we get a lot done. Okay, yeah, that's one way to think about knowledge. To think about justification. That's one way to get the word through. And this is kind of what I think about science. Science is justified in the same way. It's a simplified model. It's a representation of reality, not reality itself, but it's useful. And that's its job. And so justified. Cool. But, and even if we use the standard, so the standard's changed, note, from what we talked about in art. In art, the standard for justified meant not literal. That was how we got to the idea that art is unjustified because it's not literal. But here, justified has a different meaning. But even if we take the same meaning, even if we treat justified in the same way, and according to the same criterion, then it still passes as justified here. Not literal. Okay, so knowledge is not literal because It's not about a real object, right? It's not. It's about, ultimately, I guess, something in relation to me. We're creating a new object again, and just as we did with metaphor. But I mean, Harman doesn't mention that, but I think that's what's happening. The word untrue, however, not particularly impressed with this one. So, untrue. Harman says it's untrue. Our belief in knowledge is untrue because it's not about reality. It's not about the real object anymore. Fine. I mean, and that makes sense in Harman's philosophy. I agree. It's not about the real object, if we could even say that there was such a thing. But note the double standard here. If we compare this with the unjustified true belief of art, in art was judged not untrue, but the criterion for true was something like real. Right? We created this new object in our imagination, so it's not untrue. So true was kind of connected with this notion of there being a new object, a real object. If we use the same standard here, then we have to say that knowledge is also true. Because again, it's a creation of a new object. It must be. We can't know anything about the real object. We're creating a new object, an object that stands out on those background assumptions, that paradigm. We step in for the real qualities, yada, yada, yada. So if we use the same standard that we used for art, then knowledge must also be true. Or vice versa, if we use the standard that we're setting here, if we use this with art, took this and applied it to art, then we'd have to say that art is untrue, because art is also not about a real object, not about reality. So, you know, we're shifting definitions to get this kind of neat inversion between knowledge and art, knowledge and metaphor. So we've got metaphor is unjustified true belief, and knowledge is justified untrue belief. But we've secured this kind of tidy little inversion through shifting definitions, through kind of playing with the words and the way that the criterion we're using. So again, it's not a central part of Harman's philosophy, but just something that I noticed and thought it was kind of interesting to look at and dig down into a bit. And the same with belief, the word belief. As with art, what is this a belief about? It's not that there is no real anything that we're believing anymore. We've cancelled all the real objects and the real qualities. I don't need to believe in a sensual object and sensual qualities, because this is just what I perceive. So the notion that I should have to believe in it is again redundant to me. So yeah, as with art, I find this to be just kind of a cute semantic exercise that doesn't really mean anything. All right, let me move into this is the real last section, the wrap up. Okay, so this is just a real quick overview. I'm not going to do a summary like I normally do, because pretty much the whole video is a summary. So I'm not going to do kind of one of those in-depth summaries. I'm just going to wrap up with a few comments. So the Kantian real object, real quality pairing, that was a real miss for me. I just didn't find it. I didn't find it believable. I didn't even find it feasible, and I just didn't even see how it made sense. We cancel the real every time it pops up in any meaningful way, and then we just end up having to cancel the real down until we just get the sensual objects and sensual qualities, in which case what's the point of having this whole real dimension in the first place? And I think it just creates more metaphysical problems than it offers solutions. So that for me is kind of the biggest drawback I see to object-oriented ontology. Ontography, because it's based on the real object, real quality thing, is also unappealing. And as I mentioned, this kind of simplified rubric, I feel gets some neat ideas. It gets some neat, the idea of connecting the different points of the kind of the model is kind of cute and gets you something interesting, but it's ultimately a little bit simplistic, I think, and just lacks the depth. And as I said with the discussion on space and time, I don't think it really explains anything in the end. When you break it down, I don't see the explanation on offer there. And the other main criticism, I guess, is the flat ontology. Definitely not liking that. And strangely, we feature a lot in the book. We feature in just about every topic that I've talked about. The definition of an object, aesthetics, ontography, knowledge even. We are central in that. So yeah, I don't even think Harman remains too stuck too rigidly to this idea of a flat ontology, which is fine, because I don't think he needs to. I don't think it's the right way to go. So there was that. And as a final kind of comment here, I think object-oriented ontology definitely has some uses, and it kind of did change the way I think about things a little bit. I like that definition of an object, as long as it doesn't take itself too seriously. I think as long as object-oriented ontology doesn't take itself as providing metaphysical truth, then it is there is value in it. There is definite. I like that way of thinking of everything as an object, even events, and it just gives a different perspective. It just opens up vistas that might not otherwise have been available, and that means it opens up avenues for action that may not have been available before either. So as long as it doesn't take itself too seriously, then I think object-oriented ontology is nice. However, I think Harman would totally disagree with that. He definitely sees this as a description of reality itself, as a description that is true. So yeah, with that caveat in mind, that's kind of where I wrap up my thoughts on this topic. So that's it for me on this object-oriented ontology. The next video I'm going to look at Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. That is going to be a little bit critical. I don't like to be too critical, because these guys are distinguished philosophers. I'm just some random dude on YouTube, but yeah, and just take it as that. These are just my opinions. I certainly have the utmost respect for everybody that I'm criticizing on this platform. But yeah, just what I happen to think about these particular philosophies. Anyway, thanks for sticking with me through this. I think this is a long video, but I hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you for the next one.